So hello and welcome to Inspiring Interviews, Conversations about Breath. This is where each week we talk to a well-known breathwork facilitator to find out their journey to how they became who they are and how they teach what they teach and how they change people's lives. Now today I am extremely excited to be joined by the author of the best-selling breathwork book, The Oxygen Advantage, Patrick McKeown. Welcome, Patrick. Lovely to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here, Benedict.
Should we just start by maybe taking a breath together?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do that. Thank you. And if I'm honest, I'm a little bit nervous about taking a breath in front of you, Patrick. I've heard tales of how you have these kind of Jedi mind-like powers that you can just hear someone's breathing and know all about their biography from them. Is that true?
Not quite, no, but I suppose when you're working with breathing for 20 years, you can pick up on somebody's breathing a little bit quicker than others. It comes with the trade.
Sure.
And yeah, so often when I'm giving a course to students, we give it in a classroom environment. So if I'm writing on the board, I'll be able to pick up on breathing of people behind me, and I can tell them that. But it's all fun anyway.
So it's not like eyes in the back of your head; it's like ears in the back of
No, you're listening to it, yeah, and you're so in tune as well. Like the one thing about the breath is when you focus on your own breathing, it's easy to focus on somebody else's breathing.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so when I do one of these interviews, I always ask people a little bit about their bio, something for me to read out to begin with, and I'm going to read out a little bit about you that you sent me. So, Patrick McKeown BA MA, Ireland-based international breathing expert and author Patrick McKeown was educated at Trinity College Dublin, and he completed his clinical training in Russia in 2002. He is the breathing advisor to Laird Hamilton's XPT. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology and published by international medical journals and leading book publishers. His latest book, The Oxygen Advantage, which is published in 14 languages, combines specially formulated techniques to reduce breathlessness during physical exercise, increase oxygen delivery to the brain, improve sleep, concentration, and to remain focused under stress. With 125 trained instructors across 30 countries, the Oxygen Advantage is recognized as a foremost authority in breathing for exercise, performance, and sleep. Patrick has worked with elite military special forces, SWAT, and Olympic coaches and athletes. That's quite a bio you've got there, Patrick.
Yeah, but don't give too much credit to bios.
How does it feel when someone reads out all those kind of amazing things?
I don't know. I don't give it much heed, to be honest with you. I use it as a means that the work can be taken sometimes a little bit more serious. I suppose if you're talking about something, you have to be able to support it. You have to be able to show that you have the experience. And, you know, too often there's an emphasis on academic qualifications.
Sure.
And the academic, what's taught in our educational institutions is not necessarily the information or all of the information that's pertinent to providing a good field of work. I think a lot of the innovations don't happen in universities, they're all happening outside of it. And in terms of breathwork, you know, breathwork is all happening outside of the universities. So, of course, we do need science, we need studies, we need research, but we also need common sense and we need experience. And with breathing, common sense certainly plays a role with it.
I love that. I love that the common sense plays a part of it, and also that some of the best work is done outside of universities, and some of the most powerful stuff is done out of that. So, and that's really where I'd like to come with this interview. I am trying to inspire people around breathwork, and what I find is the most inspiring part is to hear people's stories and their journeys and the challenges that they face to become the facilitators and the teachers and the leaders that they are. And that kind of story you don't often find in universities. So this is going to be an interview about you, and hopefully inspire some other people into breath work as well.
Sure, sure.
So we've heard the glossy shop front version of yourself and some of the amazing things that, things that you've done or had done. I'm going to give you a minute to tell us about some of the facts about Patrick. So maybe some of the human facts and some of the things about you and your life. You ready for that little challenge?
I should go for it.
Okay, 1 minute. Patrick McKeown, 101, off you go.
I suppose I have a job that I found by accident. I fell into it and I love it. And I have one purpose, and that would be to increase awareness of functional breathing patterns, and also to use breathing as a means for people to reach optimal performance. We need it from childhood right through to older age, because when we look at breathing, we need to look at the impact it has on anxiety, on sleep, on mental health, and on sports performance. It's a challenge. I'm resilient enough, and I had my own background of having breathing problems for 20 years, that it's given me a great strength in terms of putting the information out there. That's who I am.
That's great. Okay, I love that. And you mentioned you had breathing problems for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe let's just start with that. Maybe let's go back to when you had your first experience of breath, before you were a breathwork facilitator. And it may be that your first experience of breath was an experience of no breath. Maybe take us back down to when you first remember your breath.
I'm not sure when I first remember my breathing, but I remember when I was in primary school, I must have been about 8 or 9 years of age. And there was this physically fit school teacher. And I remember him running around the football field at the back of the school. And we were there as kids, and we came back, and he was obviously absolutely gassed out, really, striving and breathing hard to recover his breathing. But I looked up to this guy, so I thought it was good to hard breathe. So as a kid, I remember actually practicing breathing hard, even though it was absolutely the worst thing that I could do. It probably contributed to my symptoms and drove my health as dreadfully poor in terms of asthma, blocked nose, sleep, anxiety, stress, because I was hard breathing. It was switching me on, but it wasn't switching me off. And then I remember, I didn't really think much about the breath after that. I was a chronic mouth breather. I read a book by Paul Wilson called Calm. I have no idea what year, but it's going back a good few years, probably 20 years, 25 years. And I was doing an exam, and I was a bit anxious about the exam. So I had this belief, take big breaths, because of course the whole Western world and every yoga studio and Pilates studio and all of these people who are teaching breathing, they must be all right. Take a big breath. So I went off for a walk for 5 minutes, taking these huge big breaths, and I went into the exam hall absolutely out of my head with lightheadedness. Completely the wrong thing to do. So so my thing about breathing was learning how to do it badly or how to do it wrong. And it was only then when I read a newspaper article in 1998, your breathing during rest should be through the nose. It should be silent.
Breathing through the nose, and
that's during rest.
During rest. Okay, so you told us a little bit there about little Patrick when he was a chronic mouth breather and he had asthma and blocked noses. Maybe you could give a little bit of colour to what your life was back then when you were in primary school. Paint a picture for us about your life and maybe your health as well.
Okay. Academically in primary school, I was very bright. I was one of the top kids in the class. I was one of the youngest in the class, but I was well able to keep up there. And there was another guy, David Riley was his name. And we would have considered ourselves to be the top two in the class in primary school. Now, different story when I got into secondary school. It all fell asunder. So I often say to parents that when we see children coming in with their mouths open, mouth breathing during childhood can affect your academic ability. And the reason it affects your academic ability is because it poorly influences your sleep. And a child who is mouth breathing, they tend to have poor sleep quality. And as a result, they have 10 times the risk of learning difficulties, 10 times in terms of academic achievement. So secondary school, it all came asunder. I came from fairly well up in terms of, towards the top of the class, not the top of the class, but towards it, right down towards the bottom of the class, falling asleep in school. And it's really one of those things that your intelligence is measured as a means. Your intelligence is measured by the results that you get in academic achievement. And I often felt that as a child, I had an intelligence there, but for some reason, I don't know what happened in secondary school, because I couldn't concentrate, I couldn't focus, and I lost total interest in school. So in 1988, at 14 years of age, I left school. And I left school to work in a shop that was beside me, and in a shop that I was working, totally illegal now, but I was working there from the age of 11, doing small little jobs. So I was always independent. I always wanted my own little financial freedom. I didn't come from a family of having income. So I was driven. And at 14 years of age, I left school, and that was it. And my whole life was to go into supermarket business. And at 15, I ended up going back to school. And I hung around with different individuals in terms of a peer group that were more academically or more driven to achieve. And that would have given me an impetus then that, I had a goal to get into Trinity College in Dublin. So I worked towards that goal despite having poor concentration. But I worked 10 and 12 hours a day. And I put in so many hours. I totally, put all my teenage years into getting into Trinity, and I did. And I got my degree. So it's, I often make when we're saying it to parents, and parents say, well, my child is very bright. My child's a mouth breather, but they are very bright. Yeah, your child is a mouth breather, but they are very bright. And that's the way I was. But I wasn't always bright, because the whole thing about sleep, Benedict, is, and it really, this doesn't get attention, unfortunately. And, how many children are going around with their mouths open? We know from studied children, it's anything between 25 to 50%. We have no statistics for adults, because it's very seldom does mouth breathing get studied in adults. And at the same time, we know that their sleep is impacted. And I will say to any of your listeners, if you wake up with a dry mouth in the morning, you're not having a good night's sleep. If you're breathing through your mouth during sleep, you're more likely to get up to the bathroom to go to sleep. You're more likely to get up to go to the bathroom during the night. You're more likely to have sleep fragmentation. You're more likely to snore, to have obstructive sleep apnea. And if your sleep quality isn't right, and I'm not talking about avoiding mobile phones and don't drink alcohol and have a dark room and an airy bedroom and all of that stuff is good. But the real key, if you want a decent night's sleep, is breathe in and out through your nose. And I discovered this back in the late 1990s. It absolutely, completely changed my life. And it changed my life in terms of waking up feeling refreshed, alert, concentrated, and in a better humor. How can you expect individuals to achieve academically? And as I said, we're labeling these kids as intelligent based on academic scores that they achieve. And nobody is looking at these kids' sleep. I think it's a shame. And, I think it's dreadful. I think it's been completely overlooked.
And your journey through this, really sounds, your personal journey through this, you are a case in point to this. To drop out of school, to be really bright in primary school, and then to drop out of school in 14 and to go to work, legally probably, but then be inspired to go back to school, that is quite an inspiring thing to do, actually, to have an ambition that, no, I don't want to just, I want to go to Trinity College Dublin, and I want to do this really well. And you dedicated, not easy to do 10, 12 hours a day when you're a teenager. I know, because obviously I was a teenager, but I'm a high school teacher as well. Mm-hmm. For a teenager to be that motivated to do that, where did that come from, Patrick?
Well, I suppose one of the reasons, in 1988, I made a trip to Canada, and my cousins live outside Toronto, and they would have been doing very well for themselves in terms of business, etc. So I was exposed to, the comforts of living in terms of looking at a society. When I arrived in Toronto Airport, seeing cars back in the late 1990s that were way ahead of what we had in Ireland. We have to bear in mind, Ireland was a very, very economically deprived place in the 1980s. And we had a huge amount of mass emigration, pretty much. Anybody who was leaving school in Ireland, they were destined to leave the country because the country wasn't able to employ these people. So you had mass unemployment, mass emigration, you had a brain drain. And so sometimes you come across, you have experiences in life which direct you, and you don't always know when these are all going to fit in together as a puzzle. But I would have had an innate ambition, even despite leaving school at 14. I was leaving school at 14 because I felt school was doing nothing for me. Like when you have a maths teacher telling you that you'd be better off in a potato field picking potatoes, it doesn't give you much room for confidence. And I have to say as well, Benedict, I had some pretty useless teachers. And I can say that now, looking back at 47 years of age. I had teachers that didn't inspire me. Now, I had a few great ones. I had Luke Brady, tremendous, brilliant teacher, English teacher. John Caffrey, he was a great teacher of commerce and business. But I had some pretty lousy ones. I had individuals who were teaching me. They shouldn't have been teaching any child. They should have been out in a potato field picking spuds because that's all they were fit for. And it's kind of remarkable. It's when you look back in hindsight how life is such a journey and how it can fall into place. And it fell into place for me. Now, you do need to rely on gut feeling. Because I've made some big changes. Like I did my economics degree and economics and sociology degree in Trinity, and then I went into the corporate world, which I hated too. So you see that there's often a silver lining. I was working for a company called Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I was one of the first Irish employees when they came into Ireland to expand, and I felt that we were very much owned by the company. We were controlled by the company. IT was controlling us. There was a lot of stress in terms of meeting weekly targets. We were told that we had autonomy and we had no autonomy. And we were almost sold this vision of a company, to give our life to this company. And I didn't like it. And I didn't like the lack of freedom. I didn't like going in there of a Monday morning. And I thought to myself back then, I says, yeah, I want to make money, but I don't want this stress. I don't want this hassle, and this isn't for me. So I stayed there, and I then read an article in the newspaper about the importance of breathing through your nose and breathing light. And I was putting that into practice while I was there, and I noticed it was making a big change in how I felt. So sometimes it's not always the company, but it can be the employee. And, it's just your perception. But as human beings, we believe we do the best that we can in that situation. And then I was driving from one side of the country in Ireland. I live in Galway, and I was driving back from Galway to County Meath. And I had this hunch that I wanted to teach breathing. And it was very, very overwhelming feeling. Now, financially, it made absolutely no sense whatsoever. I had no background in breathing. All I had was my own personal experience. So I knew that the people who developed the technique that I came across were based in Russia. I knew nobody from Russia. Ireland, we didn't have just as much. Everybody was trying to get out of the country and very few people were coming into the country. So we didn't have any Russian people that I knew of. So I contacted the Russian embassy in Dublin, and I asked them, could they track down the people in Russia who were teaching this breathing technique? And they did. So, of course, it was the only place that I could think of. Where would I find somebody who speaks Russian? Contact the Russian embassy, kind of makes sense. So they did that. They got me the information, and that was it. Life-changing career. I fell into breathing. And, one thing I will say is the job I hated, and I don't like multinationals. When you're in school and you're thinking about getting into university, and you're often feeling, as I was in the business school, the guys who were getting the jobs in the big companies, And now looking back, I actually feel sorry for those guys. I feel sorry for those guys going into the big multinational corporations, because ultimately they don't have the freedom I have. They're not doing a job that they love. They don't have creative expression. They don't have independence. So I would say if somebody was to say anything, what could they draw? And yeah, I've spoken about this before on London Real, and some people said I was giving out. I'm not giving out at all. But all I'm saying is this, you know, there is more. It's really important that you can achieve the values that you want in your life. And, you know, it's not about stress and money and all of that. And that's really Western society. Western society is driving us into almost a frenzy. And sometimes with this COVID, it could be actually, yeah, it's unfortunate for many people, but it could be the best thing that may happen as a whole, because it's forcing people to slow down. It's forcing us to spend more time with family. It's probably forcing us to reevaluate different things. So it's amazing how life is a very interesting, and of course nobody can explain what's going on, but you know, we just go with the flow.
Sure. Well, there's been some big changes for you, certainly. Now, normally what I do is I love to acknowledge all the, you know, the teachers that my guests have had, like the ones who've had a positive impact. But, you know, listening to your story here, it really feels like I want to acknowledge the bad ones that you've had in your life. Like your terrible teachers at school. And, you know, as a teacher myself, I abhor bad teaching, because I know the damage that it does to pupils, not just in their academic qualifications, but in who they become as a person. So, like, it makes me shudder when I hear about bad teaching. So I just want to acknowledge them. And then your experience as a young man working in a big multinational, and how destroying that was, and how it feels to me like they were some of the biggest teachers that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. Because now the school teachers per se, I just think that the school teachers, they weren't bad people.
No.
They were just in a job that they didn't like. And that's the problem. They shouldn't have been in that job. They should have been doing something else. They were very intelligent individuals, but it wasn't suited.
Yeah.
And the multinational corporation, I'd be very grateful to that, because when I went out working in a small little business setting up breathing with no background, I did my training, I had no capital. I started off with a budget of €5,000, and that included paying for my fees in Russia and my flights. So in actual fact, I started off a business with zero, with nothing. I had no company car, nothing. I gave that all up because of, you know, with enterprise. And I slept on a couch for the better part of about 6 months to a year in my current wife's family home. And I used her mother's little Fiat Uno or Fiat Panda or whatever it was to drive around. So, but I gave it really my best shot. And I have to say that gut feeling, if you have an overwhelming gut feeling, because doubt does come into the mind, there's always going to be doubt coming in. And I'd also say is don't overthink things, because if you overthink things, you won't act at all. But if you get that gut feeling, you have to rely on your gut. And it's really important that we bring some attention into our breathing in order to create space that intuition can emerge. And yeah, now I've had some bad teachers, but I've had a few good ones. And I'm going to give one is Eckhart Tolle, which I'm sure you're well aware of.
Oh, yeah.
I read his book on a trip to Canada. I bought it back in 2000, 20 years ago. I bought The Power of Now. And I bought it in a bookstore in Canada. And it was one of the most life-changing books that I had ever read. It was an amazing book in terms of the power and the stillness in between the words, and not necessarily for the words itself, that you could read the book and you were reading it not just for information, but you were reading it for the presence. That by reading the book, it would bring you into presence. And very few books do that. I read, you know, Deepak Chopra, and it doesn't do anything for me. Krishnamurti, pretty good stuff. I actually like Osho, brings me into presence as well, even though, of course, society gave him a really, really hard time. Yeah, it mightn't have been all his fault. I know there was some stuff when you watch the Netflix on the documentary on Netflix, you know, there's some very sinister stuff there. But I have to ask, was he coming from a state of presence? And I think he was, because when I read his books, and I've about 18 of his books, it brings me into presence. So, you know, the breath and stillness of the mind, and everything is intertwined. And ultimately, this is, you know, spending 20 years stuck in your head in a state of agitation and stress, to be able to bring some stillness into the mind. It's one of the best gifts anybody can come across.
Oh, I can't imagine a greater gift that you can give someone, and I love what you say about, you know, how reading Eckhart Tolle or Osho, it's the presence and the space in between the worlds, so it becomes an experience. I love that. Okay, well, fascinating. Some beautiful. There's a lot coming from you here, Patrick, that I would love to zoom in on, but I would really like to kind of go into your story a little bit more. Now, you mentioned this briefly, and I think this is amazing. You know, as a young man, you decided, no, okay, I don't want to be in the corporate world. And fair enough, you know, I can imagine that there's a lot of people out there who feel like that. And yet you had this feeling, you know, you read an article about breathing lightly, and you contacted the Russian embassy to find out about these people. Amazing. You know, in this 20, I mean, there's a lot of breathwork now. 20 years ago, there would be nothing around there. And so you've contacted the Russian embassy to find out how to do training, and then you went and did it. I would love to hear more about that experience of going over to Russia 20 years ago and studying over there. Who did you study with? What was that experience like? Please tell us a story about that.
So yeah, so it was in early of 2002. I traveled over to Russia, and I stayed there for a couple of months, and I was at a clinic called the Buteyko Clinic of Moscow. And Dr. Konstantin Buteyko was the founder of this technique called the Buteyko method. And he was still alive at the time, although he was elderly. And he was in and out of the clinic, but he wasn't working there full-time per se. So, yeah, I flew over, stayed there. It was pretty cold. I can remember it was freezing at the time, a lot of snow on the ground. And I immersed myself in that. Now, from a technical point of view, I was being trained by medical doctors, but I didn't always know the science, because science wasn't my background. But I still grasped the information, and I grasped more so the technique that they were teaching. And I came back down to Ireland, and I set up on 17th of March, which is Patrick's Day in 2002, is when I opened my small little office in Galway. And I got a newspaper article. A journalist wrote a small newspaper article about what I was doing in a paper called the Galway Advertiser. Sometime maybe around April of that, or March or April, but it was fairly, you know, soon after I arrived. And I got my first 3 clients, and that was able to cover my rent for another month. And during that time, then I'd get another couple of clients. And really what I did was I had a wonderful opportunity, because I had no mortgage, I had no costs, I had a small rent to pay. I kept everything to an absolute minimum. It was labor intensive, and I had nothing to lose. And I remember even 6 months into it, I said, if this all falls apart, I still come out of it with 6 months of the best experience of trying to apply a business. Now, we have to bear in mind, there were no websites there. So we were doing a lot in terms of, we were very fortunate with small media. They were doing articles about what I was doing in terms of asthma, and teaching children with asthma and adults with asthma to breathe through their nose and to improve breathing patterns. So yeah, television, I was doing some television, and I used to be a nervous wreck. I used to be like a rabbit staring at the headlights. That the whole slagging against me was that I would be interviewed and I wouldn't even blink for the entire time of the interview. So I'd be in this total state of nervousness. But it wasn't a case of fake it till you make it, but it was a case of maybe just a little bit naivety on my part. If somebody was to say to me that they were going to do it, I would say, that's crazy, it's not going to work. And genuinely, I would be thinking that. So sometimes we never know. You know, people talk about, show me a business plan. I said, listen, I never would do a business plan, because you haven't a clue. You know, if you're trying to project what any business is going to do. And this was a service business. You have really no idea. And ultimately, this wasn't, of course, you need to make money to survive. It's really, really important. But my motive was really about getting the information out there. I wanted, especially children, youngsters that were mouth breathing, to be able to, help their breathing, from that point of view. Was there resistance? Yes, there was. I remember going to an asthma conference in 2005, and the CEO of the Asthma Society of Ireland sat down beside me. And I was thinking to myself, God, this is great, I've got really the most important person in the room sitting down beside me at this point. Now, I'd already written 2 books. I wrote a book then in 2003, and I wrote a book in 2004. So my name was getting out there a small bit in terms of asthma and breathing. But anyway, she sat down beside me and she started talking away, a couple of the niceties that people normally say when they're looking for something off you. And then she says, Patrick, she says, I don't want you to ask any questions during this conference. So she sat down beside me to silence me. And I was just remember, I was in my 30s at the time. What threat was I? You have a panel of really highly educated doctors up there on the table talking about asthma, but they're talking about everything except breathing through the nose and addressing poor breathing patterns. And for me, it makes sense with asthma to breathe through your nose. And normally, they would ask, well, show me the clinical trials. And yeah, we've 20 clinical trials, but you need about 500 clinical studies for something to be shown to be efficacious, that medical science will embrace. And it usually takes 20 years for an idea to be embraced by medicine when it's been consistently proven for 20 years. So I felt that there was absolutely no support from the medical profession in terms of breathing for asthma, no support from the Asthma Society of Ireland. If anything, it was resistance. But I was very fortunate that people really got on board. And I have been lucky. I've been able to maintain this as my livelihood since 2002. Now it's a different story. Now I don't have enough time in the day. Normally I'm booked out for about 18 months in advance and consistent, and about 90% of my work is traveling abroad. I'm currently writing a new book, and I've got another book after that. And it's been a tremendous journey, absolutely tremendous.
Oh, I love the idea of not writing a business plan and just trusting yourself to do it, and also that you're being asked to not ask questions at the Asthma Society. Okay, so maybe would you like to give a very brief summary of what it was that you learned over in Moscow? Were you taught in Russian? Did you have a translator, or was it in English? So maybe just give us a little bit of a taste of what it was that you learned over in Russia and that you brought over to Ireland, 18 years ago. I'm guessing it's all about just making sure that you breathe through your nose and breathing lightly, but I'll let you tell that.
Yeah, there's a gas called carbon dioxide in the blood, and carbon dioxide is not just a waste gas. Oftentimes in breathing, we're told, bring in oxygen and get rid of the waste gas carbon dioxide. But you have to bear in mind, discovered back in 1904 was an effect called the Bohr Effect, BOHR. And basically it states that your red blood cells release oxygen oxygen is released from the red blood cells to the tissues in the presence of carbon dioxide. Now, how you breathe determines the level or the pressure of carbon dioxide in the lungs. And it's the pressure of carbon dioxide in the lungs that determines the pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. So the harder you breathe, the more you get rid of carbon dioxide from the lungs. This in turn reduces carbon dioxide in the blood. And as carbon dioxide reduces in the blood vessels constrict. And the bond between red blood cells and oxygen becomes strengthened. Now, this is an amazing effect. Bearing in mind that how many times have you went into a studio about breathing and you heard the instructor telling the students to deliberately increase the volume of air that they are breathing? If you deliberately increase the volume of air that you are breathing, you are going to get rid of too much carbon dioxide from the lungs, from the blood through the lungs. And this will cause vasoconstriction. It may contribute to bronchoconstriction, but it will reduce the amount of oxygen delivered to your tissues. So people are hard breathing in a belief that it's good to bring more oxygen to the tissues, but in actual fact, it's doing the opposite. So if you, for example, most people will know this. If I said to somebody, take 5 or 6 big breaths, they will tell you that they will feel lightheaded. That's not a sign of hyperoxygenation. That's a sign of reduced oxygen delivery, reduced blood flow to the brain. So many people are breathing hard chronically, called chronic hyperventilation syndrome. They may be breathing through the nose, they may be breathing through the mouth, but they'll tend to have a faster respiratory rate than normal and more upper chest breathing. So the volume of air that they are breathing every minute, every hour, every day, for somebody with asthma, it's having quite an impact on their lungs because it's contributing to their airways constricting. So you could argue that people with asthma breathe faster because their airways are narrowing. And if your airways narrow, you feel that you are not getting enough air. And if you feel that you're not getting enough air, you're going to breathe faster. That's correct. But the faster breathing is feeding back into the airway narrowing. Look at people who are breathing with anxiety and panic disorder. They breathe fast, they breathe hard, they breathe upper chest. And these people will go to psychologists, to psychotherapists, to psychiatrists, and they will do counseling and, some wonderful interventions. But who is looking at the respiratory physiology? And what's more, if they are looking at the respiratory physiology, what are they teaching the students to do? Because as long as that student or client or patient is breathing fast and hard using the upper chest, they're stuck in a state of fight or flight. So we have to bear in mind that stress, and long-term stress especially, is the greatest impactor to our breathing patterns. And even when the stress is removed, the faulty breathing pattern will continue because it's a behavior that's learned by the body, probably neuroplasticity. And as long as we breathe that way, it's going to have some negative manifestation. So Buteko's thing was breathe less air. Now, breathe less air. If you breathe less air, you feel suffocated. So his thing was deliberately reduce the volume of air that you are breathing. In actual fact, do the opposite that most yoga instructors are telling. And again, this isn't a hit on yoga instructors, but it's just making that point. Do the opposite in terms of what most people in the Western world say. Breathe less air to reduce the volume of air that you are taking into your lungs, to allow carbon dioxide to increase in the blood, so that you feel a tolerable air hunger, and sustain that for about 3 to 4 minutes, and see what impact it has on your body. Can it improve your blood circulation? Can it increase the amount of watery saliva in the mouth? Does it make you feel drowsy? By changing your breathing patterns, you can influence your blood circulation and oxygen delivery. And it's not about breathing more, it's about breathing less. But nasal breathing is really the first start to that. And the nose is connected with the diaphragm. Your nose will slow down breathing. And nasal breathing improves oxygen uptake in the blood by 10%. But if you do physical exercise with your mouth closed, nasal breathing, you will have increased carbon dioxide in the blood. And that in turn will allow additional oxygen to be delivered to working muscles.
That's a beautifully good summary, actually. If you've not heard that before, I think, obviously you're very practiced at explaining that. So I'd love to hear a bit more about your own personal journey from being asthmatic and your own breathing problems to physical health. Maybe you could tell us about your journey through that. Yeah,
so when I first discovered the work of Dr. Buteyko back in the late 1990s, it was a bit of a challenge in terms of making the switch from mouth to nose breathing. I used his nose unblocking technique, which is basically breathe in through your nose, breathe out through your nose, pinch your nose, and walk holding your breath until you feel a fairly strong air hunger. Then let go and breathe in through your nose. Wait a minute and do it again and repeat it 6 times. And your nose will generally be open during that time. And the more you breathe through your nose, the more your nose opens. So I remember at one point reducing my breathing and feeling suffocated. And I had no instruction, by the way. I had no instruction because I was after reading a newspaper article. But, I felt, okay, well, just we'll give it a go. I was feeling suffocated, but I started to feel calm while feeling suffocated. And it was kind of there was some bizarre feelings, waking up on the second day. I taped up my mouth on that night, and I taped up my mouth the second night. And I've been taping my mouth 20 years since. But waking up feeling totally alert on the second morning. The first morning, yeah, I was kind of getting used to it. Second morning, I was feeling alert. Wheezing reduced 50% in that week. I was still having wheezing for, 6 months, probably a year afterwards or so, but hugely diminished, greatly decreased. And that's after being wheezing for so many, many years. And typically we would expect 50% less asthma symptoms in 2 weeks. So you have somebody with asthma with symptoms. And even if you look at the clinical trials, only one clinical trial was around its time, published back in 1998. Individuals with asthma, they had 21 years of having asthma. So they were long-term asthmatics. They had 70% less symptoms. They had 90% less need for rescue medication. And they had 49% less need for inhaled corticosteroids at 12-week follow-up. Now, the control group was taught physiotherapy, the in-house hospital program at the Mater Hospital in Brisbane, and they had 0% change. So, Buteyko worked, and without a shadow of a doubt, it worked. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Of course, with experience, you can learn more and you can apply more things. Like we do cadence breathing, coherent breathing. We look more now into the biomechanics. But most certainly the biochemistry and the oxygen advantage was very much an emphasis on the biochemistry. Whereas my next book will be emphasizing that as one pillar and coherent breathing and the biomechanics as the other two pillars. And yeah, it's made a tremendous difference in terms of energy levels and quality of the mind, because your breath is really the bridge between the body and the mind, and paying attention to our breathing is absolutely crucial, and never feel guilty about paying attention to your breath. As Western society, we're often compelled that we have to be doing stuff all the time. I've got 2 dogs out there and 2 cats. Never see the cats and dogs feeling guilty about lazing out in the sunshine. They bark if they want to, the cat goes hunting if it wants to. And then it comes back down and it relaxes, whereas the human being is totally guilty. We've been indoctrinated because of society into doers, and it's madness, and like I've fallen into that trap as well. We've all fallen into that trap, but the one thing that I have is I have a practice that I have connection with the breath most of the time. Especially if I go for a walk, I'm not stuck in my head. I make a conscious effort to bring my attention onto my breathing during work. Every now and again, take my attention out of the mind onto the breath. When I'm working with clients and students, I will work with clients and students, not being stuck in my head, but bringing my attention onto the breath. And the breath is a great friend. It's a great friend because it's something that's constant, always, regardless of the environment that's outside.
The breath is a constant friend, no matter what the environment is outside. Yep, that's definitely true. It's always with us. Okay. So I know from, I was an asthmatic all my life as well until I discovered breathing as well. So I know it has helped me as well. I'd love to hear a bit more about your journey from, a little office in Galway in the very early 2000s to becoming the, I suppose, the breathwork guru, if you like, one of the breathwork rock stars of the world, and having your work published. Maybe tell us a little bit about your journey through writing books, or what happened really from Patrick's from 15 years ago starting off his breathwork business.
Yeah, I suppose I had information and I had to get it out there, and I could understand that people could be skeptical and cynical about who's this guy. He doesn't have a medical background. He's not a physiotherapist. He's not a physical therapist. Who is this guy why would I trust him? So I wrote a book, and I wrote a book called Asthma Free Naturally back in 2003. And that was published then by HarperCollins in 2004. I self-published it first, and I printed off 3,000 copies, and they sold. And HarperCollins then published it. HarperCollins in the UK and Red Wheel Visor in the US. So that got a book deal back in 2004, 2005. And then I wrote a book for kids called ABC, Always Breathe Correctly. And I was working mainly with asthma. And then dentist, Dr. Hugh McDermott, contacted me back in 2007. He says, will you do a talk for us children? We're interested in the effect of mouth breathing on the development of children's faces. And this was news to me back then. So I said, grand, I'll go and do the talk. And of course, I got interested in that field. And then I made contact with Professor John Mew in the UK, who's been totally vilified, by the way. Here's a doctor, an orthodontist, and an amazing individual. And for 40 years, he's been saying, don't extract teeth and don't retract teeth, because it's making the mouth smaller. There's not enough room for the tongue. And what's happening is that when teeth are extracted from an individual, their airway is compromised, and it's increasing the risk of sleep apnea for the rest of their life. And he's right. But what do his colleagues do? Criticize him, vilify him. And this is what is happening when anybody comes out with something that's unique. And it's not that he's criticizing the current ways. Well, maybe he is. But his intention is to say there's a better way to do this. And why not research it? But very few people want to research it. However, now it's starting to become more common practice. And I made contact with John Mew and Mike Mew back in 2009, 2010. And I used to fly over to Purley and sit in their dentists in their surgery. And I used to look at them work with the kids coming in. So you'd have the parents, you'd have the kids, and you'd have me sitting in the corner. And they'd be chatting and telling me. And I was picking up all this information from the two of them who were gracefully giving it. And I wrote a book then, Buteyko Meets Dr. Mew, bringing together the Buteyko method and the orthodontic work of Dr. Mew. Then I wrote a book called Anxiety Free. And then I wrote a book called Sleep with Buteyko. And it was all because it wasn't about asthma anymore then. I was working a lot with people with anxiety, teaching them how do you breathe in order to improve blood flow to the brain. Can you imagine you can increase blood flow to the brain by gently softening the breath and by doing small breath holds? And not only that, the thing about meditation is that people with anxiety often find an unwillingness and a frustration when they are told to meditate. And I can totally identify with them. And it was my experience as well, because from 2010 to 2013, our economy here in Ireland was absolutely downtrodden. And there was a huge amount of anxiety due to reckless individuals in the banking system. And that's all I say, and stupid politicians who didn't do anything to stop the flow, the idiocy of capitalism. And capitalism is good, but you need to manage it, and you need to have bright and talented individuals putting the brakes on it sometimes. Whereas we as a country, we went totally out of control, and the aftermath was devastating. People committing suicide, mental health deteriorating. So from 2010 to 2013, I was giving courses on mindfulness, but it was mainly females who were coming in. And I couldn't help thinking, where are all the males? Because the man is less able to cope with mental turmoil than the female. I could argue that the female is just better, well able to cope, maybe because they're talking their problems through, whereas the man hides in his cave, etc. So I often wondered about mindfulness. I used to ask the people coming in, how many of you here have ever meditated? And it was only about 5%. And these were individuals prone to anxiety. And I asked them, how many of you now still meditate? And it was almost nothing. And here is a group of people that would get the most out of meditation, but yet the uptake on it was very low and the compliance was very low. So clearly there is a problem. Can you imagine having an emotional turmoil where the mind is all over the place and you're sitting there with the goal of paying attention to your breath? Your mind runs off, you bring your attention back. Your mind runs off, you bring your attention back. You feel you have no control of the mind, you know, and it's possible and it's normal that people will give it up. But how not? How about giving different breathing techniques? Little breath holds, nose breathing, relaxation, physical exercise, breath holds during physical exercise to increase blood flow to the brain, which will have a calming effect. That you can get in, you can bring meditation in the back door when the brain is already in a better state in terms of the central nervous system is less agitated. So I found that fascinating. And then I was thinking, all right, where's all the men? Because they must be down in the pub, drowning their sorrows, drinking plenty of pints of Guinness or whatever. So I started then with the oxygen advantage, looking at sports performance. And yeah, it was really, really interesting because I was giving it out to a totally different group of individuals. With Buteyko, I never really had people who were well who came to me. If you were doing Buteyko, you came because you had asthma, you had sleep apnea, you had snoring, you had anxiety, etc. But with Oxygen Advantage, this was all for the healthy person. So how to breathe to improve blood flow, how to breathe to increase oxygen delivery to the tissues and organs, how to breathe to improve your sleep, your focus, your concentration. Because it's not just, we mightn't have anything wrong with us, but at the same time, performance can be improved. And the human mind in the Western world is very agitated, and it is becoming even more agitated since the invention of the smartphone back whenever, 2007 or 2008. And anxiety levels are increasing. And there's a lot of competitive pressures on people. And there's a lot of stresses on teenagers because they're comparing beautiful looking people on Instagram. Because the only people who pose, if I go into my Instagram feed, and we do it because we have to, it's our way. Social media, I could absolutely do without it. But in terms of awareness, we actually are reliant on it because it's one of the few means now. It's the whole communication to everybody has been monopolized by a small number of companies. But when I go into my Instagram feed, I'm seeing six packs, oh, beautiful body, oh, beautiful female, beautiful looking male. And I'm saying, Jesus, I'm the most ugly person. So I'm looking at my phone, I'm saying, oh my God, I must be totally ugly because they're all beautiful on that. Because the only ones that are posing are people, of course, who are very, very self-confident and, you know, they like to show themselves off. But what about the poor kid is looking there and saying they're a little bit insecure, they're not confident about themselves, and they're seeing a distorted sense of reality because now they're thinking that they are inadequate when they're comparing themselves to the people who are posting. I think it's a really screwed up system. And it's a screwed up system in terms of the pressures that are put on people and also the demand on people's time. So I know I went totally in a tangent there.
Yeah,
but yeah, so my journey was like the books, putting it out there, and international travel, and yeah, teaching instructor. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful journey.
I really get that impression from you, Patrick. That the journey that you have had has been. I mean, I'm guessing there's been, you know, hard times and lean times, but actually it's been an easy, enjoyable, fulfilling journey that you've been on. And, you know, that is really inspiring for people to see that by letting go of, you know, that kind of corporate world that you were in and doing something that you felt in your gut and you felt passionate about, has led you on an incredible journey. And it feels to me that you feel like you are doing what you are meant to be. You feel like you are in presence with yourself, I think was your words that you used. And, you know, I get inspired by seeing that. And I know other people will as well.
Yeah, like we had a college reunion a few years ago, 20 years after Trinity College. So it was 2017 was I finished in 1997, or whatever, 2017. And I felt kind of sometimes I was the, you know, the inadequate one at the time as you're there. And really, we should never care about any of that stuff. Because I was involved, there were barristers and bankers and this, that, and CEOs and this. And here is me as a humble little guy teaching breathing. Or what do you do for occupation? I teach breathing. But you come out of that, and I was thinking, who's the happiest? I'm as happy as anybody, and if not more happy than any of those people. So sometimes we have to bear in mind, what is it all about? The perception of individuals who have achieved so much in terms of what society says that they have achieved, and they may be very empty. So never feel compelled not to follow your dream, not to investigate your talents. And yeah, be realistic. You know, we're not all going to be rock singers. You have to have a bit of talent as well, natural talent, and you have to put into practice. But it is that thing, you know, when you like doing something, it's very easy to stay on board. It's very easy to research it. Like, I have no problem reading books 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock into the evening in terms of breathing. I have no problem absorbing that information because I like it. So it's a hobby. So if you can have a hobby as a job, you're doing pretty good.
You are. And that's great advice, you know. Explore your talents, you know, put the hard work in, do something you love. It's advice for everyone. Well, we're coming towards the end of our hour together, Patrick, and that was hearing your story from, you know, leaving school at 14 and then going back and working, doing something that you didn't like, and then starting off in a completely new field, going abroad to study it, and then coming back, and your journey through medical opposition sometimes, and just general ignorance of what this was, is really astonishing to hear. And I have to say, I am thrilled to be with such a pioneer. Actually, that's what I think of you, as a pioneer in the West of bringing breathwork out here. So I thank you for coming and sharing just a few bits of your journey today.
Sure, you're very welcome. Thanks very much, Benedict.
And is there a breath technique or a breath thing that you would like to maybe lead us in, just to finish off this interview?
Yeah, like I'd say to people, you know, we often hear about the benefits of breathing hard. Why not try breathing light? Just to see, can you influence your blood circulation? It's very simple. Pay some attention onto your breath and have your mouth closed. Breathe in and out through your nose, and to feel the slightly colder air coming into your nose and the slightly warmer air as it leaves your nose. And as you breathe in, gently slow down the speed of the air as it's coming into your nose. And at the top of the breath, have a total feeling of relaxation to the body, so that you're having a relaxed and a gentle breath out. And after you breathe out, when you need to breathe in again, take a very soft and slow, gentle breath in. So you're taking a soft and slow, gentle breath in, almost to the point that you feel hardly any air coming into your nose. And at the top of the breath, bring a total relaxation to the body, that you're having a relaxed and slow breath out. So when you breathe in again, breathe so soft, almost that the fine hairs within the nostrils do not move. Can you really slow down the speed of your breathing, that you feel hardly any air coming into your nose, that there's no turbulence in the nose, that you cannot hear your breathing, you cannot feel your breathing, that your breathing is so light. So you're taking a very soft and slow and quiet, gentle breath in, and at the top of the breath, a total feeling of relaxation to the body. So the objective of that little exercise is to breathe less air now than what you were breathing before you started. And when you breathe less air, carbon dioxide increases in the blood, and this gives you a feeling that you are not getting enough air, gives you a feeling of air hunger. But breathe gently like that for about 3 to 4 minutes. Breathe with air hunger, a tolerable air hunger, not that you are stressed. So you want to have an air hunger that's manageable, that's tolerable, that's fine, that it's not putting you into a stress response. How do you get the air hunger? Don't deliberately interfere with your breathing muscles or anything like that. Just soften the speed of the breath coming into your nose, and at the top of the breath, a total feeling of relaxation to the body, that you have a relaxed and a gentle breath out. As you do it, pay attention to the temperature of your fingers, pay attention to the saliva in the mouth, pay attention to whether you're getting more alert or drowsy. When you have air hunger, which signifies that carbon dioxide is increased in the blood, typically your hands will get warmer. Typically, you will have increased watery saliva in the mouth, and typically you will feel drowsy. You activate the body's parasympathetic response by having a prolonged exhalation. You stimulate the vagus nerve. You help to improve heart rate variability. You help to restore the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. And also, in addressing with reduced breathing volume with air hunger, you're also increasing blood flow and oxygen delivery to the tissues. So even though you feel a little bit of a hunger for air, in terms of the breath, check what happens in your body.
I definitely feel calmer now, and my hands definitely feel warmer, Patrick. That was beautiful exercise. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time in joining us today, and I'm going to be breathing lightly for the rest of the day, I think.
Good stuff, and through the nose, always good.
Always good. Patrick,
Okay.
thank you very much for today.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Benedict. Take care.